Well, greetings again there, Tubaneros. For parte dos in this little look into the reasons for U.S. embargoes, old and new, based on an amusingly revealing article in World Affairs by Michael Totten. Amusing because of its transparent deception, but revealing just for that reason. Revealing also is the exact parallel between the U.S. attitude toward Red Cuba and the way Black Haiti was treated after it became an independent state, the world's first Negro republic. Like today's Cuba, it was considered a pirate of the Caribbean of the wrong color by those treasuring whiteness of skin as well as whiteness of politics. Haiti did not have to be a political or economic success for it to be feared and loathed as a dire threat. The example of a slave revolution that defeated a white European power sent chills down slave-owning spines from Brazil to Virginia. As recounted by William Jay in his 1837 book, Government on Behalf of Slavery, the U.S. Congress passed an act in 1806 to, quote, suspend the commercial intercourse between the United States and certain parts of the island of Santo Domingo, Haiti's former colonial name, that were not in the acknowledged possession of France, namely the Republic of Haiti. 20 years later, Secretary of State Henry Clay announced that under the actual circumstances of Haiti, the President does not think that it would be proper at this time to recognize it as a new state. Let members of Congress at the time also be heard. John McPherson Berrien of Georgia orated, end quote. Consistently with our own safety, can the people of the South permit the intercourse which would result from the establishing relations of any sort with Haiti? Is the emancipated slave, his hands yet reeking in the blood of his murdered master, to be admitted into their ports, to spread the doctrines of insurrection, and to strengthen and invigorate them by exhibiting in his own person an example of successful revolt? Gentlemen must be sensible. This cannot be. The great principle of self-preservation will be arrayed against it. I have been educated in sentiments of habitual reverence for the Constitution of the United States. I have been taught to consider the union of these states as essential to their safety. But they have a stronger feeling. Need I name it? Is there anyone who hears and does not understand me? Let me implore gentlemen not to call that feeling into action by this disastrous policy. Or Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri. The peace of 11 states in this union will not permit the fruits of a successful Negro insurrection to be exhibited among them. It will not permit the fact to be seen and told that for the murder of their masters and mistresses, they are to find friends among the white people of the United States. Or Representative Henry A. Wise of Virginia. We are called to recognize the insurrectionists who rose on their French masters. A large portion of those now in power in this black republic are slaves who cut their masters' throats. Christophe himself was an insurrectionist and a revolutionist. Their government has the stamp of such an origin. And will any gentleman tell me now that slaves aided by an English army ought to be recognized by this government, and there being such is no argument against it? No, it is the abolition spirit alone which would have us say to these men whose hands are yet red with their master's blood, you shall be recognized as freemen. We wish to establish international relations with you. Never will my constituents be forced into this. This is the only body of men who have emancipated themselves by butchering their masters. They have long been free, I admit. Yet if they had been free for centuries, if time himself should confront me and shake his hoary locks at my opposition, I should say to him, I owe more to my constituents, to the quiet of my people, than I owe or can owe to moldy prescriptions, however ancient. So, these speeches were delivered in a vote to censure those Latin American states who were about to recognize Haiti, an early form of OAS manipulation. This was just 3 years after the Monroe Doctrine was established as formal U.S. policy, but note that it's being applied to a regional state that has thrown out an external power by asserting self-determination. To say how little this doctrine means in reality, though the aid of the English Navy to Haiti is thrown in as justification for isolation, as if the British Navy and armed forces didn't already have a strong traditional presence in the Caribbean. So, the U.S. stood aloof, in the words of Congressman George Grinnell of Massachusetts, as if Haiti was a lawless tribe of savages. While all other powers have acknowledged them as an independent sovereignty, we refuse to recognize them. Others profit by their commerce at our expense. No commercial relation exists between our two governments. How little has changed in the U.S. attitude toward its so-called sister republics of the hemisphere if they get out of line, namely if they threaten the sanctity of North American property interest, whether it's slaves in the cane fields or any other commodity exchange. Yes, to baristas, if free elections were the true motive for the embargo, one would have been slapped on the island when General Batista overthrew the corrupt but freely elected president Carlos Prios Soares in 1952. But it did not, because Batista was a good dictator. He encouraged American investment and the mafia because, remember, as Mr. Totten told us in his article, economic progress can be made without political liberalization if it's necessary. The U.S. had 10 times the leverage over Batista that it's ever had over Castro, and if it had used just a tenth of that to uphold the democratic norms of the hemisphere, as Totten calls them, he wouldn't have to worry about the Castro 60-plus years later. Did I just say the democratic norms of the hemisphere? Well, I was again quoting Michael Totten. What norms is he referring to again? The testicle pullers of Chile, or the Dominican Republic, or El Salvador? Because these were much more the norm of political life during the reign of the Kilpatricks over the Journal of World Affairs. And I can recall no embargoes instituted against Pinochet or Trujillo or any of the Saddam Hussein regimes of Latin America. When these countries finally evolved beyond such crude repression, it was because they were successful in crushing dissent in more extreme form than was ever necessary in Castro's Cuba. You can also be sure that the refugees from U.S.-subsidized terror and torture were not granted most favored refugee status when they could find their way across El Rio Bravo. Thus, the sanitized nations of the Western Hemisphere were made safe for democracy again, and its well-chastised peoples were permitted to emerge from the shadows and engage in political rituals stripped of all subversive, that is, meaningful content. One can ask why the Cuban people did not overwhelmingly demand the elections they were promised during the Revolutionary War itself. Because democracy had been reduced to meaningless ritual like lighting candles in church. Cuba's past experience with electoral politics was as a corrupt endgame, a path which the U.S. itself seems irretrievably headed. The young revolutionaries of the Sierra and the Plains had risked their lives to redeem their island. Why should they share power with old politicos who had stood by and risked nothing at all? As self-serving as that argument might be, it had merit enough to convince many that the old republic was bankrupt to the core. The United States and many of the anti-Castro movement only discovered the virtues of democracy out of desperation when their vital interests were threatened. It had never been too highly sacred a principle before, and in truth the main reason, again, the U.S. promoted North American-style free elections, and does it now, is only to buy them, as they did the Nicaraguan elections in 1989. In fact, any revolutionary or too reformist government in Latin America that took its mandate and sovereignty too seriously has always found itself at odds with the U.S., no matter how democratic its form. And any that did play by Washington's rules, like Arbenz in Guatemala or Allende in Chile, found itself stabbed in the back from within or attacked from without. Castro was determined he would not join these unfortunate comrades. If he had to choose between seeing his revolution overthrown, his country invaded, and himself assassinated, or being a son of a bitch that crushed the bourgeoisie as a class, slapped down dissent, and allied openly with the Soviet bloc, there was no doubt which course he'd choose. And like it or not, he survived precisely because he's done the very opposite of what Washington has demanded of him. Whatever you want to say about Cuba, it must be acknowledged that the revolution has included more citizens into the political process than was ever the case in the old order. It was a formal democracy, but these forms never stood in the way of what really mattered, the barriers of class and race, giving the majority little to lose by its passing. And whatever changes may be coming in Cuba, Mr. Totten may be sure of two things. That the Cuban people feel the country is theirs since 1959 in a way it was not before, and will demand it to be even more so, not less. And in conjunction, that it will be much more jealous of the island's hemispheric sovereignty than it was ever allowed to be before that year. I know that I'm going to hear Castro criticism for defending Castro. His regime is a Führership, not a republic, with everyone treated like slaves in the Castro family plantation. Well, if that's the case, then Cuba isn't socialist either. But those constantly emphasizing the communist adjective seem to think this gives their attack special meaning, and too often they show they obviously don't know the meaning of communism, democracy, or much of anything else they talk about. Although for years establishment northern wonks like Mr. Totten told us the Castros needed the embargo to justify their failures by demonizing the Señores Imperialistas. In truth, there is merit in keeping things as they are, just because the Totten types are finally questioning it. There is nothing generous in their change of attitude. Because to normalize Cuban-U.S. relations, and let's put that in air quotes, as Totten and the U.S. policy establishment understand the term, would be a return to the economic colonialism and political subjugation of 50 plus years ago, which is the real goal of destroying the Castro regime. The U.S. lost a satellite regime and simply wants it back for the prestige of doing so, as well as recovering its lost properties, vindicating its vindictiveness toward the defiant and disobedient. The island will be colonized not just by U.S. investors looking for more cheap labor and real estate, but by U.S.-born Cuban Americans who will make aliyah, to use the Israeli phrase, who see it as a palm tree Zion to be reclaimed regardless of what the natives think. These natives, in turn, will not only find themselves economically and politically dispossessed, they also will not stay to participate in this new Israel of the Caribbean. They'll be flooding northward by the hundreds of thousands, hoping to realize that illusion of free market prosperity right in its own heartland. After all, Taunton states in his piece, like the true imperialista Yankee, that the path forward for Cuban prosperity is obvious. Bring as many people as possible into the global economy, and specifically the American economy. The people want it, clearly. What they want is the fantasy of U.S. consumerism, not the reality of the U.S. marketplace. Be that as it may, their idea of integration is going to be substantially different from Michael Taunton's. Those of you like him who want such normalization and integration, be prepared to open your communities and public treasuries in support of a real exodus of refugees, okay? No bitching about sending a Coast Guard flotilla to turn them back, like you did with the Haitians. There's that timely knock on the tube phone. All right. Hello. Who is this? The spokesman for the Cuban American National Foundation. You just want to say that when the communist regime finally crumbles and you come back to retake your island from the mongrel horde, you'll be sure to rebuild it on a firm footing of prosperity. I see. No doubt with the help of these contractors just coincidentally feature on the back cover of this very issue of World Affairs. I mean, look what this powerful, experienced government contractor, the floor folks, did for Iraq and our own Haiti, post-Katrina New Orleans.